Good morning. I'd like to share with you a few introductory thoughts on the question of how Scotland could change its working practices to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way. To start off, a little apology, I'm going to share some data with you. This data shows how two variables have changed over the last 40 years or so. On the one hand, we have data around GDP per capita. This is a measure of how much work we're doing and how productive we are in doing that work. The other metric is global CO2 emissions. I've presented this data at a global level because, as we talked about before, there have been quite big shifts in the type of work being done in different parts around the world. And by looking at these things on a global measure, we can kind of avoid some of those complications. The important thing that we can see is that there is a very, very clear, strong correlation between these variables. As GDP per capita has increased, the amount of work we're doing, how productive that work has increased, so global emissions have also increased. And it's this very strong positive correlation or association that have led many people to argue that we'll only be able to tackle the climate emergency if we actually change the way and the nature and the type of the work that we're doing. But as well as thinking about the amount of work that we're doing, we can also think about, it's also important to think about the meaningfulness that people get out of the work and the satisfaction that they get out of their work. And there are important questions to be looked at in terms of whether the low carbon and climate resilient transition can allow people to have more fulfilling and more motivated jobs. As well as thinking about the nature of work that we're doing and how much work we're doing, we can also think about where we're working and the way in which we get to our workplace. As part of the COVID pandemic response, many of us have had to get used to working from home. But as we look to recover from that, it's not yet clear how medium-term patterns in working practices might change and whether there will be a greater opportunity to work from home. As we all learned this morning, there may be opportunities for working from home for more people more often than there were before the pandemic. And we can expect that in many situations, this will allow us to reduce our emissions. But as we will also learn, it's sometimes not quite as clear-cut as you might first think. A change in where we work will also perhaps change our adaptation priorities. And it will be perhaps slightly less important to worry about making sure that our offices and that our industrial spaces are resilient to climate change, but even more important to think about our homes and our communications technologies and how we can make sure that they are resilient to the changes that we will see in the climate. If we're going to think about emissions from work, then we should be thinking about how employers can change their emissions and reduce their emissions. And they have two main ways and options that are available to them. Firstly, they can produce lower carbon goods and services. Perhaps, as we talked about last weekend, they can switch from making diesel and petrol vehicles to making electric vehicles. Secondly, they can also change the way in which they work, and they can encourage their employees to be more carbon effective and carbon efficient. Perhaps they can introduce carpooling schemes for their employees or change their machinery and lighting so that it's more carbon efficient. It's easy to say these things, but it's much more difficult to achieve them. Habits get entrenched, and for many businesses, they'll be much more focused on their day-to-day operations, and thinking about issues around reducing emissions may be well down their list of priorities. In that context, there are four main ways that we can normally think about encouraging businesses to reduce their emissions, or drivers for businesses to reduce their emissions. Firstly, regulation and incentives might tell companies what they need to do or make it more expensive for companies if they fail to change their practices. Secondly, businesses might look to respond to growing consumer pressure or growing consumer opportunities. We see more and more products in the marketplace, from our toilet roll to our coffee, where there are low carbon green alternatives which are available. Employers might look to seize those business opportunities as the low carbon green economy grows. Thirdly, employers might look to learn from their competitors. And they may see that they perhaps get a competitive edge if they are able to attract more motivated staff as a result of their stronger green credentials. And finally, it's important not to underestimate the important role that personal conviction by businesses, often encouraged by their employees, can play in driving forward a transition within companies. To help us explore these issues in more detail, I'm delighted to say we have 4 speakers with 4 different perspectives on this issue. Firstly, we have Will Strong from the think tank Autonomy, which focuses on the future of work and economic planning, who will talk to us about the possibility of a 4-day working week. Next, we will have a video from Jamie Cook from the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacture and Commerce, who will discuss the concept of universal basic income and what role that might be able to play in driving forward the low carbon transition. Thirdly, we have Catherine Trebek from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, who will talk about how governments think about economic performance and whether changes in the way that we conceive what that constitutes economic success can help reduce our emissions as well as deliver other goals that society might have. And finally, David Simons from the consultancy WSP will talk to us about the role of working from home, the opportunities that might provide, and some of the things that we need to think about if we are going to encourage greater home working in order to reduce our emissions. I hope you find the videos as captivating and interesting as I did, and that I hope they will help inform your deliberations on this very important topic.